Hello, and welcome back to the Inside Java podcast, a podcast about everything Java brought to you from the team at Oracle who makes Java. My name is Ana Maria Mihalceanu, and I recently had a conversation with Jonathan Gibbons about JavaDoc developments, insisting on JDK 23's enhancement proposal 467 that introduces Markdown in JavaDoc documentation comments. JavaDoc is our source of truth when it comes to understanding in-depth Java API, but also an inspiration on how we can document our own code. Hence, Jonathan and I had a conversation on significant changes in Java's documentation component and associated tools, how JavaDoc is maintained, code documentation practices, and many more. Enjoy the show. Jonathan, welcome. I'm honored to have the father of JavaDoc as my guest. Your code impacts lives of millions of developers, yet you are very discreet. Can you please tell us more about yourself?
Hello. Well, I joined what was JavaSoft back in the mid to late 90s. So I've been around Java for almost as long as Java has been around. Initially, I was in the testing tools team, working on things like test harnesses that were the background to JCK. And actually subsequently JT-Reg, which is something that many OpenJDK developers are familiar with today. That set up my interest in tool development. And then eventually I transitioned out of testing tools into the mainstream tools for tools like Java-C and JavaDoc. And that's what I've been doing since then.
Wow, that's quite a bit of history there, Jonathan. Thank you. Well, thought to start our conversation with some terms that generated some debates in my developer life. Is it JavaDoc or JavaDocs? Well, can you please demystify a bit of the terminology around JavaDoc?
As this is a podcast, you miss, and it is hard to explain kind of one other ambiguity here, that is it JavaDoc with a capital J, capital D, or is it just a capital J and the rest lowercase? What I will say these days is that the formal word is JavaDoc with capital J, capital D, but that is when it's used as a noun, we tend to use it to refer to the entire system, the overall subsystem within JDK. That being said, many people use JavaDoc or JavaDocs as a colloquial or slang term in many ways, and that's because JavaDoc means different things to different people. You will see people talking about editing the JavaDoc, meaning they're editing comments in source code. Other people will talk about publishing JavaDoc. And so you can go to external libraries, and if someone's published a project, you'll often see there's a link on the homepage for JavaDoc, meaning their API documentation. So for my part, I tend to use JavaDoc, capital J, capital D, to refer to the system as a whole. I'll use all lowercase JavaDoc to refer to the tool itself. And then for maximum clarity and to reduce confusion, I will talk about documentation comments being the parts of Java source code that provide the input to the JavaDoc tool. And I talk about API documentation or generated API documentation for the output produced by the JavaDoc tool.
Well, thank you for the explanations. Now I'm going to use that in all my debates, and whenever somebody's going to come and say, is it JavaDoc, JavaDocs, JavaDoc with lowercase, which one is correct? Well, JavaDoc itself, the documentation component, helps us, the Java developers, all these days, and it's become more interactive and more accessible, even on smaller devices like on my mobile phone. How do you identify all these needs for Java's documentation component, like becoming easier to access on mobile devices, more interactive, and so on?
For the most part, JavaDoc, the tool, is reactive. We try and react to pain points that we see with people using JavaDoc. So it's not like we have a design team going out there saying, this is a must-have feature for documentation comments. So one of the early changes was that we noticed people trying to use JavaDoc output as it was back in the JDK 8 era. Smartphones were coming online, and you could see people in meetings trying to read that era of JavaDoc on a phone. And there was a lot of scrolling involved, let's put it that way. So that's an instance of where we saw how people were trying to use the tool or the output from the tool. And it's like, yes, that's not as convenient as it could be. We can make it better. Likewise, when we transitioned into JDK 9, we were transitioning away from HTML4 into HTML5, and so we were losing the frame on the index frames on the left-hand side of the screen, and we had to improve or replace that ability to navigate around the documentation, and that was the basis of the idea for JavaDoc search. And again, back in those days, search engines were not as good or well focused as they are today. And so it became natural to actually build search into JavaDoc with a focus specifically on the documentation bundle people were looking at. Then more recently, as you and your listeners will know, Java has a 6-month release cadence. Compared to the 2 or 3 year release cadence that we used to have. And so people don't necessarily pick up on every single release of JDK. And it's possible that they may have come from 8 and gone to 11 as a long-term support release. Now it's 17, but they may have stopped off along the way. And so we had a lot of discussions about how can people best identify the changes since they last looked at the code. And that led to the introduction of the what we call the new in version pages. So there's a summary page where you can select the versions you're interested in, or the recent versions that you might be interested in, and JavaDoc tool will produce a listing of what is new in those releases. Also, talking about how do we identify needs, we've also focused on improving the specifications for JavaDoc. And unlike other parts of the Java system, the Java language has the Java language specification. The VM has the Java virtual machine specification. The APIs have all the libraries that JavaDoc serves to document. Those are formal specifications and kind of have corresponding test suites, that sort of thing. JavaDoc is in a somewhat gray area and is not a Java. So the syntax of documentation comments is not a formal JCP specification. And so part of our work has been to improve the quality of the JavaDoc specifications. And in so doing, we notice where there are holes in the system or where it can be improved. And these days we have three specifications. Kind of one is the specification for the syntax and tags that you can put in a documentation comment. We have another specification which is somewhat internal, but it is a public specification for the overall nature of the output generated by JavaDoc. And we provide this specification partly because it gives us something to live up to and test, but also it allows other tool developers to extract interesting parts of the documentation from the generated output. And then the other specification we've put out there is for JavaDoc search. That in the beginning we thought, oh, search is so easy. People will just type something in and it will work. But the trouble is, with any such discovery system, people don't always discover all the features. And so as a combination of a guide to JavaDoc search and a specification of what we support, there is actually a formal specification for that now. And anyone who's interested can find that specification by clicking on the help link at the top of pages of generated by any recent version of JavaDoc. And there will be a link to the search specification. So that's how to find out about all that's wonderful about JavaDoc search.
That's very good to know and actually helpful for all of us, because I admit most of the time when I'm searching for standard names or for specifications, I tend to go to Google, and Google doesn't always share with me my Google searches. Either I don't Google very well, or who knows, doesn't tend to give me the best results or the most updated results. So now we know how to get to those specifications right from the JavaDoc API documentation itself. Well, I always thought that documenting such a large and important code base is not an easy thing to do. I mean, it's a code base that is useful to so many developers. I mean, we are most of the time end users and we work with Java, but a lot of people also contribute to Java. So can you share with us some of the ingredients that make JavaDoc so robust across all this time? What has helped you? What tools are there that help you to maintain it so good?
The primary ingredient is a lot of work behind the scenes. When I first encountered the JavaDoc source code, it was a very old program. Even back in JDK 5, JDK 6 times, it was an old program, and it was written at a time before there were widespread testing tools and much less sense of good programming practices. So JavaDoc has not always been robust. That being said, we put a lot of effort into making it more so, just because making a tool, any tool, robust is self-defense against bugs coming in from external people. And clearly we don't want to ship buggy software. So we have put a lot of emphasis into developing, improving and developing the internal test suites for JavaDoc. But even so, output generated by JavaDoc is a collaboration between the author of documentation comments and us providing the tool. So we, the authors of the tool, cannot guarantee the accuracy of the information provided in documentation comments. That being said, we have put effort into writing tools that provide feedback and diagnostics where it is possible to detect them. There have been some instances in the past where entire paragraphs of text were lost from the generated documentation because someone mistyped some HTML and forgot to put in a closing greater than character, for example. And so initially we put a lot of work into a system called DocCheck. It was initially internal. It then was released as an open source tool under the OpenJDK Code Tools project. And it checks for what we were finding to be the common errors that were popping up. So this was badly constructed HTML. It was broken links, accessibility errors. Back then it was called Section 508 kind of errors. So DocCheck proved very useful for helping improve both our documentation and for providing it for other people to check their own documentation. But one of the problems with DocCheck is that it reports issues in the generated documentation, meaning in the generated HTML file. So any error messages point into the output files. That's like debugging Java class files by knowing that the error is at a particular bytecode offset within the class. It's not very helpful, or rather, it takes a lot of work to map that back to the original text. In the same sort of way, kind of DocCheck reports errors in the output, and it can be tricky or tedious or both, to track that back to issues in the documentation comments or other tooling used to generate the output. And so with that in mind, we wrote another subsystem called DocLint, based on the -X-Lint software, which, as an aside, I was the one to implement that in Java-C. It was one of my first tasks here, so I was sort of leveraging that history of mine. And another problem at the time, computers were still slow back then. People did not like running JavaDoc because JavaDoc was slow to run. So they would only compile their code, and there were all sorts of hacks round about then to compile the minimum necessary set of files. And so to help people detect errors or issues in their documentation comments, we designed DocLint so that it could be invoked from Java-C as well as from JavaDoc. This meant that when people were compiling their code and they'd gone to the trouble of running Java-C and the syntax analyzer and the like, it was just a command line option away to run DocLint as well and be informed of any obvious errors. And DocLint and DocCheck have never claimed to be a full HTML validator, but what we did do was react to the most common errors we were seeing in generated code. So overlapping HTML tags, not properly nested, or unclosed tags when they should be, that sort of thing. So with that in mind, there's been this underflow background activity to make JavaDoc more robust and to help developers write better, more accurate comments with fewer errors in them.
Wow. That's an impressive history, and it totally makes sense that there are tools that help in binding and making it all robust and looking that great for us. I mean, to us, if you're just going to a browser and you're browsing documentation, it feels like flawless. But behind the scenes, there are obviously tools and processes happening to keep it all together for us. For our listeners, because Jonathan, you mentioned the Code Tools project. So this is another OpenJDK project that has a lot of tools in it. Usually the tools that are there are dedicated to help the OpenJDK developers. But to our listeners that have listened to the Panama podcast and heard about JExtract there, JExtract is one of those tools that is part of Code Tools project as well. And as you can see, it's not helpful just to OpenJDK committers. It's also helpful to the rest of the world as the developers. So maybe check out that project and see what tools are there as well, and which of those do make sense in your daily development too. So with this divagation aside from me, let's get to our subject, to the JDK 23 big news. So for many years, I've seen that JavaDoc comments have used a combination of HTML and JavaDoc text. Me as a Java developer, when I wrote my first JavaDoc comments for my APIs, it was a combo of HTML and JavaDoc text. But nowadays, we can add CSS, we can add JavaScript, we can add code snippets, we can externalize code in those code snippets. And with JDK 23, we can even write Markdown syntax in JavaDoc comments. What motivated this choice?
There's a bunch of different topics in what you just said. So sort of going through some of them. CSS came in naturally, that when we started, JavaDoc supported HTML 3.2, and over time it transitioned to 401, and in particular the 401 transitional form with frames and frame sets. But nowadays we've migrated to HTML5, and CSS came in because essentially HTML forked. Kind of HTML became the semantic presentation, and CSS was introduced as a complement to provide the stylistic presentation. So focusing more on CSS was a very natural development, just because that's the way the documentation technology in general, meaning HTML and friends, that's how that was developing. Likewise, JavaScript comes in because within HTML, sometimes people want to write event handlers within documentation comments. So you want to write onload or whatever. So it became natural to support or to allow JavaScript. But that being said, there's actually more emphasis on restricting the use of JavaScript, because one concern we have is that JavaScript is a natural attack vector as a security issue. So behind the scenes, there's a lot of work to detect inappropriate use of JavaScript, such that users actually have to opt into using JavaScript and be aware of all the issues that might be there. You mentioned snippets. There was nothing there officially before, because in a minimalist world, you basically didn't need it. That you could write an HTML pre-tag surrounding either an HTML code tag, or somewhat better, a JavaDoc open curly @code tag. But even so, we were observing that there was no stylistic consistency to the presentation of code examples. And some of the issues were very much legacy code, like because some of the documentation that we see being processed started off in HTML 3.2 when there was no CSS. People were using HTML tags for their visual effect. So even though you can think of a snippet as typically being what I call a pre-code block, we were often finding that people were embedding it within a block quote HTML tag just to get it indented a little bit. So these days, if you want to do that sort of visual presentation, you should use CSS. You shouldn't be using or abusing HTML tags. And so snippets came in as a way of providing a uniform style, and particularly across big code bases like the Java SE and JDK documentation. It becomes good if code samples all are presented in a similar way. And another feature of snippets is that because we're providing a mechanism for user to write a snippet, rather than just going to the whole cloth of a pre-code block, when you use a snippet, you get buttons so that you can cut and paste the snippet. And kind of one feature we wanted to support was the ability to cut and paste the snippet into a window of an IDE so that people could run it directly. Markdown is a much bigger, longer story. The genesis goes back to JDK 9, and there were people that were trying to write or to hack JavaDoc to support Markdown comments. And if you look at it in a simplistic way, it's not easy to do, because the hack that was generally tried back then was that if you process the comment through Markdown at the beginning, before you analyze it with JavaDoc, then there are constructs like JavaDoc tags that will have the wrong effect inside a Markdown comment. And you can get overlapping bugs from overlapping tags and that sort of thing. Likewise, you cannot process Markdown late. So kind of people were thinking, oh, I've got this text, this documentation comment, which is just HTML tags and JavaDoc tags. I can convert it to HTML, and any bits of Markdown that remain in the text will be converted. That also doesn't work. And so to introduce Markdown, it really is necessary to come up with a way of merging two languages. So in terms of why we wanted it, it was clear Markdown was an upcoming standard. People wanted to write in Markdown. The difficulty was always figuring out how to do it.
Yeah. Thank you for the history. It was very, very helpful, but I have something to mention on the topic of people writing code, large code snippets. Well, sometimes people develop SOAP APIs and they need to give examples, and sometimes the SOAP requests and examples can be very lengthy. That marked my youth, sorry. And ended up writing a lot of comments, like big comments. I was kind of forgetting where the method is because of that. Thank you. That is very good to know that Markdown actually didn't come up as a wanted feature in the recent releases. It was something that has been thought throughout the years, and now in JDK 23 we're going to have it as a final feature. And that gets me to another curiosity of mine that I've seen in the GDK enhancement proposal, that the Markdown documentation comments are written in the common mark variant of Markdown. Why this variant?
There are many variants of Markdown, and by variant, that means they're different. And so at some fairly fundamental level, it was necessary to pick one. I will say in passing that there were suggestions that a user should be able to nominate the version or variant of Markdown they wanted to use, but that would sort of lead to somewhat craziness, because one characteristic of JavaDoc is that one library may link to documentation in another library. And so you would end up with different pieces of code using different flavors of Markdown. One big gotcha in this area is the inherit doc JavaDoc tag. Inherit doc is a JavaDoc tag that allows you in the documentation comment for a method to inherit the documentation for the method that you're overriding. And it would be craziness if those were to support different flavors of Markdown. So it was necessary to choose one. We wanted one that was well specified and had a Java implementation. We simply do not have the resources or interest to go full NIH and write our own Markdown processor. So we wanted to have a Java implementation, because one characteristic of writing documentation comments and running them through JavaDoc, we deal with lots of relatively small fragments of code where the fragment can be as simple as a short sentence on a method. It can be many paragraphs on a class declaration. But because we are dealing with potentially small text, it was never envisioned to be practical to invoke a Markdown processor in a separate process on the operating system. So it really had to be a Java implementation of Markdown that we used, and one that was open source that we could incorporate into OpenGDK. So when you put all those requirements together, you fairly quickly come to Common Mark. This was developed a few years back as an attempt to come up with a formal specification of Markdown to avoid the fragmentation that was appearing throughout the Markdown ecosystem. Common Mark has a very good specification. It comes with a test suite so that you can test anyone's implementation. And it comes with an open source implementation of Common Mark that's available on GitHub. It's called Common Mark Java. And that is what we have chosen to use in JavaDoc. I'll also say that Common Mark was not a stranger to us on OpenGDK. It's used behind the scenes in many of the OpenGDK web properties, such as JEPs, Java Enhancement Proposals, and the OpenGDK website and sites like that. So that's a bunch of reasons why Common Mark was the only logical choice to make.
So now we know that Common Mark is behind the file formatting of JEPs. Good to know. Well, on the Markdown in JavaDoc comments, why the 3 slashes? Why not treat existing comments as Markdown?
Version 1 did use original comments. Although it took us a long time to figure out how to do Markdown, It was mostly thinkware for many of those years, but it was sort of a couple of years ago we started more seriously working on it. And the initial version of Markdown support used the regular documentation comments beginning /**, but immediately followed by the letters MD to signify it as in Markdown format. This was generally disliked. It was not a popular choice. And so we looked around at alternatives. It was never, ever an option to come up with a new form of Java comment. JLS, the Java language specification, defines exactly two types of comment. It defines what's called a traditional comment, which begins /* ending all the way through to // and it defines end-of-line comments, which are comments beginning with just a pair of slashes. So we had to fit into one of those two formats. There's a lot of problems with the /* format, most notably that it is a restriction that is specified in the Java language specification that you cannot put the character sequence / within a comment. / is defined to automatically end a /* comment. And this leads to a number of hacky workarounds, including inside snippets or pre-code blocks, because if someone wants to write example code and that example code has a comment, a /* comment, you cannot write that comment inside, nested within an enclosing comment. So that led us very much towards the // end of line type of comments. And it is already the case that there are precedents in other languages for going with the 3 slashes. And one presumes that they encountered the same problems with /* comments that we were running into. So it becomes very natural to use the // comments. And yes, there is a knee-jerk reaction of, oh my God, that's ugly. I've got this big stripe of slashes down the left-hand side of my comment. But on the one hand, you get used to it. On the other hand, that's the sort of thing that can be handled in the presentation by an IDE. IDEs are already in the business of presenting source text in the most friendly way possible. And even with /* comments, we see that they have reader mode where you can show the rendered form of a documentation comment as opposed to the source form. And my assumption is that going forward with Markdown comments, we will eventually see IDE support for the // comments. And so any sort of visual concerns we can just overlook. And we come down to the fundamental reason is // comments or even // comments are more friendly to use than /* comments because you can put unrestricted contents on the right of the comment sequence.
I must admit, I love the 3 slashes syntax because for me, it feels simple and doesn't require much cognitive effort to use it. So I'm already used with the 2 slashes. I know the stars, but I'm already used with the 2 slashes. Now I needed to add the third to be able to use Markdown. But that aside, what details should we pay attention to when using it in our comments?
At some level, my answer is not much. For the most part, Markdown should just work. That once you've written your 3 slashes, you can write Markdown text. You can actually write a combination of Markdown text and JavaDoc tags. Part of the problem of introducing Markdown into documentation comments was merging the different syntax requirements of the two languages. And so one of the things that we take care to ensure is that in Markdown, you can write code spans kind of enclosed in backticks, or you can write code blocks, which are either indented or set off by what are called code fences, a line containing 3 backticks or twiddle characters. And Markdown specifies that there's no interpretation of the content within those code spans or code blocks. And so it is important within the implementation that we honor that requirement. And so you cannot put, for example, JavaDoc tags inside a code span. And that's doubly good because there's actually an ambiguity when you're writing a pre-code block in old-fashioned comments. There was an issue that there was a confusion between writing an annotation, which is typically a line beginning with an @ character, and that could be ambiguously confused with a JavaDoc tag. Now, we did actually come up with a way to mostly sort that one out, but it was important that we should get that right from the get-go for Markdown. So if you are writing a simple comment, reasonably simple up to medium level, you can just write Markdown. I expect that a common use case will be a description written, an initial description written in Markdown text. So that's the natural language description, and maybe there's some Markdown formatting characters like backticks for spans or underscores to make text stand out. You can mix it with links to other program elements. And indeed, one of the places where we extended Common Mark was that Common Mark has a reference link syntax, which means you can write some text in square brackets, optionally followed by a definition of that link. And we've extended Common Mark so that if you write a reference link, but we cannot otherwise find a definition of the link, and if the text inside the square brackets looks like a reference to a program element, then we will treat it as a reference to a program element, sort of almost as if you'd used the JavaDoc tag link or link plain. You can still use link or link plain JavaDoc tags, but in general, you may well find that you no longer need to write the @ character in the main description of a comment. Now, there are some constructs in JavaDoc that don't map directly onto Markdown. And so if you're documenting a method, for example, it's common to have some number of @param tags, kind of one for each method parameter. You may have an @throws tag if the method is defined to throw any exceptions. And if there's a return value from the method, you'll have an @return tag. So those have no direct analog in Markdown. So for those, you will continue to use @param, @throws, @return. But what I will say is that within those block tags, the description part of the tag will itself be read as Markdown. So you can use Markdown formatting within the description of a parameter or the exception that's thrown or the return clause.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for the advice. And it's good to know all the insights so that we can pay attention to that. Now, the Markdown implementation itself in the JavaDoc comments is a big thing coming up now in JDK 23. But what is some future work that you and other OpenJDK committers are considering for this implementation? Is there anything that is thought for the future, how to evolve this?
At some level, it's too early to say. I think JavaDoc evolves by reacting to the needs of the community. And so I think it will be a couple of years before we see kind of any changes to the Markdown support. There's also value in stability. Kind of we've picked a relatively stable specification and a corresponding implementation. So in terms of future ideas, there's two different areas that we might look at. One possibility is that, as I was just saying, there's no direct analog for at param, at return, at throws. But one possibility is that we could create or define, specify a more complex construct. Like if someone were to use a heading for parameters, and that heading is followed by a list, it could be that we translate that heading and the list into a series of param tags. The same could be true of throws. For return, it will be a heading followed by a description. You can only have one return tag, so there's no use in having a list. So this is on the table as an idea, but at this stage, my sense is that it's not got enough interest to make it worth investing very heavily in this, because one thing in particular is it does actually make the Markdown comment more verbose. I mean, it has more vertical lines in it. I mean, if nothing else, for parameters, you're putting in a heading and a blank line, whereas right now, using the JavaDoc tag is a very concise form of text. The other general direction we might extend the Markdown support, the Common Mark Java implementation that we're using does support the notion of extensions. And indeed, the support that we provide out of the box does use tables extension. This is tables as defined by GitHub flavored Markdown. They're relatively simple tables, but if that's all you want, that feature is there. What I will say is that for those users that want to generate accessible documentation, the support for GitHub flavored Markdown tables is very simple, and it does not generate fully compliant, accessibility compliant tables. So there's a slight gotcha there. But in general, we can play with the idea of extensions, and if someone comes up with other extensions, that will be on the cards.
That's good to know. And I think you're right. I think that probably the best thing right now is to see people using the feature, getting feedback on how they use the feature, and maybe get some ideas on what can be done in the future. But it's good to know that there are already some ideas for this feature to get expanded. And since I caught you here, and I think you know best how JavaDoc, the documentation component, and the CLI tool work, do you have any tips and tricks you want to share with us that are not so obvious to us, the end users of the JavaDoc, the API, the readers of the API, but also the users of the JavaDoc tool?
If I can go back in history a little way, back when JavaDoc was introduced, it was designed around the concept of a front-end tool and a back-end, for which we use the word doclet. And in the early days, there were many, many doclets out there. And essentially, people were abusing the notion of JavaDoc because they were using it as a language modeling tool. That was eventually done properly, first of all, in a tool in JDK 6 called APT, Annotation Processing Tool. That was subsequently incorporated into Java-C as the annotation processing feature. And so for anyone who's wanting to use modeling APIs, I recommend that they use JavaC, not JavaDoc. That means that primarily JavaDoc is now used with what we call the standard doclet. That's the doclet that everyone uses by default that generates HTML documentation. And the documentation has now gotten so sophisticated with all the features that we've added over the years, like JavaDoc search and the various index and summary pages, that no one should realistically consider writing their own doclet anymore. And because of the Java platform module system and encapsulation, it's actually not as easy as it once was to write your own unofficial subtypes of the standard doclet. All that is a way of leading up to the fact that these days the interesting way to extend JavaDoc functionality is to use a feature that's always been there called taglets, which is the ability to write your own user-defined tags. And it can be as easy as just a command line option. And we use a number of these in the JDK Java SE documentation, and one that a family of these that most people will have seen, and it's now becoming quite pervasive, is the tags for API note, impl spec, and impl note. Right now, these are not official standard JavaDoc tags. We are working to make them standard tags, but the requirement there is that we come up with a viable definition of how and where these tags should be used. In addition to writing simple command line tags or tag definitions for like impl spec, you can also write code called a taglet and provide it on a class path to the command line tool. And again, we're using some of these in the JDK documentation. So there's a couple that we see just for creating standardized links. We have links for JLS and JVMS, but also readers will have seen that we have diagrams now showing up in JavaDoc comments. JavaDoc generated documentation. So if you look at the JDK documentation, there's a module graph diagram on the module declaration page. And more recently, this was taken one step further to provide graphs of seal class hierarchies. And these are done by providing external taglets to provide customized features. So that is my favorite tips and tricks for medium advanced developers who want to produce quality documentation.
Thank you. Well, I think we should wrap up. So can you please share with us your overall recommendations when it comes to documenting our code?
By far the most interesting, the best recommendation is to write interesting and useful documentation. As we browse documentation for other libraries, and to some extent within the JDK code itself, you'll often see that if you've got a method called getFoo, someone will write a comment saying gets a foo. It's like, this doesn't materially add anything.
Stating the obvious.
Exactly. And I'm not saying anyone should go as far as ChatGPT to create the documentation, but if there are interesting things to say about a method or a field or a class, take the trouble to write it. You are writing for the future. You are writing for other people. Then it's the nature of abstraction that you should not need to read the source code to find out what a method or a class does. And then my final recommendation is proofread the output that you generate. It is the ongoing problem that we see through all of time, that people write a documentation comment and they have supreme faith in their infallibility and that JavaDoc will know what they meant. And surprise, that's not always the case. And it is actually even more important now than before, because when people were just writing JavaDoc tags and HTML tags, it was possible to write some amount of checkers. That's actually not possible with Markdown, because as much as I like the Common Mark spec, there was this wonderful line near the beginning that says, any sequence of characters is a valid Markdown program. That means that even if you mistype a construct, no error messages will be generated. Kind of the default fallback is that Common Mark will treat that malformed construct as just literal text and it will appear in your output. So it is now more important than ever to proofread the documentation generated by JavaDoc.
All valuable insights. Thank you very much, Jonathan. So in the end, we should still write our own code documentation, and we should always still think about the humans that are going to read that documentation. Very good advice. Well, folks, if you want to know more about JavaDoc and JDK tools, take a look at the content aggregated on inside.java under the serviceability tag. Jonathan, once again, thank you for taking the time to share more on JavaDoc developments. And to our listeners, stay tuned on the Java YouTube channel to hear more good news from Java.